Good evening. Welcome to a People for Effective Government online event. I'm PEG board member Dave Wilson, and I will be co-moderating tonight's event along with another PEG board member, Eric Coltrane. PEG is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Spokane, and we are also a nonpartisan coalition that organizes and holds public events that call attention to problems and issues that we face as a community, region, and nation, and presents possible solutions to these challenges through sincere and civil discourse. PEG's mission is to support and defend America's representative democracy, promote effective government at all levels, and advocate for a civil and just society. The primary goal of PEG is to influence public policy in a fashion that advances that mission. As a reminder, the views presented by tonight's guest speaker are his own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in political activity of any kind. Our audience is welcome to submit brief questions at any time via the Q&A feature. Please limit your questions to 2 or 3 sentences. You are welcome to ask several questions, but please submit only 1 question at a time. Our speaker will answer as many questions as possible before we end the forum around 8:30 p.m. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted on our website pegnow.org in a couple of weeks or sooner. Tonight's speaker is Mr. Chris Vance. Mr. Vance has been a Washington state leader in politics and public policy for over 25 years. He spent 2 terms in the Washington State House of Representatives before becoming the youngest person ever elected to the King County Council. After 8 years on the council, he was elected chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. In 2016, Vance was the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate, but left the Republican Party the next year in 2017. He is now an independent, actively trying to build a centrist, reformist alternative to our current 2-party system. Vance now serves as the Communications and External Affairs Manager in the King County Assessor's Office. He also teaches part-time as an adjunct professor at the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, teaching graduate-level public affairs. He is a frequent commentator in Seattle media outlets. Seattle Magazine has twice named Vance to its list of Seattle's most influential people. Chris Vance and his wife, Anne Marie, have 2 grown children, and they live in Sumner, Washington. Forum, our changing party system, a threat to our democracy. In his talk, Mr. Vance will share his views on why he believes the current party system has become fundamentally dysfunctional and dangerous, and why he feels that a 3rd party may be needed. Mr. Vance will also share his thoughts and insights on what happened to the 2 parties during the first year of the Biden administration and where our party stands as the 2022 midterms approach. We look forward to what promises to be an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Mr. Vance, the Zoom space is yours.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be back again, everyone. I don't know why anybody asks me to come back, because I don't have anything very positive to say. I'm part of the group of people out there that thinks that American democracy is in great danger and things are very much going in the wrong direction. But I'll try not to be too dour tonight, I guess. I'll talk for a while and then take any and all your questions. I have put in the chat a link to an essay I wrote for the Niskanen Center, where I'm a senior fellow, that pretty much lays out in writing what I'm about to say, I think. But I have to begin tonight with discussing the situation in Europe, situation with Ukraine, because it's going to influence everything in terms of our politics maybe for the next generation. Like probably a lot of you on this call, I was raised during the Cold War when, I remember my high school class, I graduated in 1980. The guys are like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. It doesn't matter. We're all going to die in a nuclear war. I mean, you had movies like The Day After and all this speculation about how Russia was at any moment going to invade Western Europe and it would be World War III and we'd all be dead. And then, in 1989, the wall fell. And by 1992, the Soviet Union had collapsed and all the countries in Eastern Europe that had been under Soviet domination, both as Soviet republics, such as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, Romania, Hungary, they were all free. They were free from Russian domination, free to have their own sovereign nation, their own national life. Many of them for the first time in a very long time. I mean, many of these cultures in Eastern Europe have spent most of their existence being invaded and occupied and sucked into somebody's empire. Ukraine has been invaded by the Mongols, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Germans, the Russians. And finally, people were going to be free to have their own identity. And the problem was Vladimir Putin and the people around him never accepted that. He's made it very clear that he thinks the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of all time, and he's determined to reverse it. He's determined to reassert Russian dominance over Eastern Europe. He refused to withdraw troops from Moldova. He invaded Georgia in 2008, still occupies 20% of Georgian territory. He subverted Ukrainian democracy until he couldn't anymore because the people wouldn't allow it. And he then invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and the world did not nearly enough about it. I'm a huge critic of Donald Trump, as anybody who knows me knows, but a lot of this is on the shoulders of Barack Obama. I mean, Putin invaded Georgia, invaded Ukraine, and we did next to nothing. But I think this event has finally got the world's attention, finally got people to understand what Putin is all about and what he means. And I think, unfortunately, the era of good feelings after the end of the Cold War is over. And we are now back to an era of heightened tension with Russia and China that is going to be right on the edge of war all the time. And I'm very afraid that my kids who are in their 20s are going to live in this world when I'm long gone. This is a major dividing point, which ultimately has to have some impact on our politics. I don't know what it'll be, but this is a big change. But for now, what we do know is that the United States has transitioned into its seventh party system. And now what do we mean by that? A party system is a term that political scientists use to describe a nation's political parties, how they function, and who they attract. Who are the members of each party? White people, Black people, poor, who is part of the British Labour Party versus Liberal Democrats versus the Tories versus, that's it. That's a country's party system. I was a political science major, and I always felt like political scientists, they're jealous because they want to be treated like real scientists where terms have meanings. They come up with these fancy terms for some relatively simple concept. But we have had, by most accounts, 6 party systems in American history. And now we're moved into the 7th, beginning with the first party system, which was Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists versus Madison and Jefferson, which became the Democratic Party. And then you had the Jacksonian Democratic Party, and then another party system, which was the Whigs versus the Democrats. And then in the 1850s, the Whig Party collapsed because there were enough Northerners who demanded a a party that was dedicated to ending slavery, or at least ending its expansion. And you saw the emergence of the Republican Party. And ever since then, our parties have been mostly just the Republicans and the Democrats. Although, and this drives me crazy because there's so many people who just think there can never be more than two parties and they must be called the Republicans and Democrats. Go back and do just a little bit of research about US House elections. And up until the 1970s, there were always third party people represented in the US Congress, at least a handful. There was always farm labor or progressives or libertarians. There have always been other parties. They just didn't have very much power. But since the 70s, it's been just, I don't think there's been an independent or a third party person elected to Congress in a very long time, but that's not normal. I mean, if you go back, look at the elections of 1912 and 1916, Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party elected a bunch of people to Congress, and they had the majority in the Washington State Legislature. So there, God is not sitting on his throne saying there can only be two parties, Republicans and Democrats. But for the most part, since the Civil War, you have had two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, but they have changed over time what it means to be a Republican or a Democrat. McKinley created a new party system. Roosevelt's New Deal landslide created our fifth party system. And then the sixth party system was created sometime between the 1964 election and the 1980 election, depending upon how precise you want to be. And that is the system that most of us are probably most familiar with, where you have the South transitioning from Democrat to solidly Republican, Republicans dominating the suburbs all across America, and Republican voters were by and large culturally conservative, but also college-educated suburban professionals. And the Democratic Party became more and more the party of non-white voters and urban liberals and unions and blue-collar workers. That was the party system really solidified by Reagan's election in 1980. Well, we have changed. We are now into our seventh party system, and Trump didn't create it, but he was the accelerant and the factor that finalized it. It probably really started to happen around 2010 with the Tea Party movement and the reaction to Barack Obama being elected, and other things that I'm about to mention. But in a nutshell, what happened is, to be very simplistic, college-educated, professional, white voters, especially in the suburbs, moved from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Today, one of the main determining factors in how you vote is how much education you have. The more highly educated, the more likely you are to vote for Democrats. And that's why you've seen areas that we always assumed were going to be Republican, like Bellevue and Orange County, California, have now become solidly, unquestionably Democratic. On the flip side of that, non-college educated white voters, union members, blue-collar voters, rural voters who'd voted Democrat for their lives and their parents' lives because the Democratic Party was the party of the little guy, they have become Republican. So I'm going to say more about this, but in a nutshell, that's what changed. We have a very good, we have a bunch of beautiful examples of this in Washington State. As I said, if you'd have told me back in the mid 80s that Republicans could not get elected in Bellevue and Kirkland and Redmond and Woodinville and Mercer Island, for God's sake, are you kidding? I mean, those people are rich, college educated professionals. They don't want their taxes raised. They're Republicans. Now they're all Democrats. On the flip side, down in the 19th district, which is rural Washington, Cathlamet, Wahkiakum County, Grays Harbor, Pacific, that area over on the coast south of Aberdeen where nobody ever goes, right? How many of you have ever been to Cathlamet? That area had always been absolutely solidly Democratic. It was mill workers, dock workers, shipyard workers, loggers, and now unemployed loggers, unemployed shipyard workers, unemployed pulp workers. It's one of the poorest areas of the state. Relatively low levels of college education, and they, in the space of 2 or 3 elections, have voted out every Democrat. It's nothing but Republican now. Complete sea change in Washington state politics and in politics around the country. So now you have in this new party system a Republican base, and the base is the voters and hardcore activists who work for the party and can be absolutely counted upon, especially to vote in primary elections. Even if they've never been to a party meeting, they're primary voters. The new Republican base is made up of white evangelical Protestants and some non-white evangelical Protestants and white non-college educated voters. Now, the so-called Christian right has been a key member of the Republican Party for a long time, although really not before Roe v. Wade. I mean, some of the Supreme Court decisions in the 60s and 70s are what radicalized or at least activated the political activism of evangelical Christians. But now they are really a key element of this coalition. And the number one most important number you must understand to understand American politics is this, okay? When we have an election, we do what are called exit polls. Exit polls are when we polled you after you voted, after you've turned in your ballot, either at polls in most states or by mail here. It's not perfect. No polling is perfect, but it is the most accurate way to judge what just happened. Because we ask people, who are you and who'd you vote for? And in exit polling, as far back as we have exit polls, you've seen the same thing. Roughly a quarter of all Americans, about 25%, sometimes a little more, are self-identified as white, evangelical, born-again Christians. Biggest voting bloc in America. White, evangelical, born-again Christians. They vote 75 to 80% Republican. 60% of all the rest of us vote for Democrats. There is no Republican Party without politically motivated evangelicals. Okay? And you can't understand anything if you don't understand that. That's why abortion will never stop being an issue, because they will never abandon it. But then now you also have, in addition to that cohort, the white non-college educated, blue collar voters I talked about, often rural or in what we call exurbs, second and third ring suburbs. There's a very big difference between a suburban voter in Bellevue who works for Microsoft and a suburban voter out in Buckley, which is, I don't know if you know, way out in Pierce County, still suburban, but one drives a Mercedes, one drives a pickup truck. One plays golf, one hunts and fishes. And those suburbs are trending heavily Republican. So white, non-college educated voters, along with white evangelicals and some non-white evangelicals, we're seeing more and more Latino voters moving towards the Republican Party because values trump immigration. On the other side, the Democratic Party in our new party system is made up of, first of all, non-white voters. Yes, you'll see stories about Trump did a little better with non-white voters, did a little better with Hispanics, although not nearly as well as George W. Bush did. But still, overwhelmingly, non-white voters who also make up about 20 to 25% of our all voters, they vote overwhelmingly Democratic. So non-white voters, huge element of their coalition. And the other is college-educated white voters, both in cities and in suburbs. I just finished Dan Evans's autobiography, which I urge anyone to read. Great History of Washington State. Dan Evans, Slade Gorton, Joel Pritchard, that whole generation of Republicans. You know where they lived? Seattle. Seattle used to be overwhelmed, especially north of the Ship Canal, was Republican. And now, of course, Republican can't get 10% in the city of Seattle. And when you think of a city, in the old days, you'd think about ghettos, people not very well off. Seattle is highly educated, highly affluent, and overwhelmingly Democrat. And in the suburbs, Bellevue's becoming the same way. That these are people who are intellectually liberal and vote for the Democrats and are driving the Democratic Party's agenda. We'll talk some more about that. So that's how the two bases have evolved. But you know, the truth is also political parties have often had a conflict between their elites, their elected officials, the party leaders, and the base. I spent my whole career standing in front of Republican crowds saying, I know you don't like Slade Gorton. I know you don't like Rob McKenna. He's too moderate for you. Hell, you don't like me, okay? But that's who won the primary, because in this state where we never had closed party primaries and party registration, we always nominated moderates. Always. The history of the Washington State Republican Party was moderates. Dan Evans, Slade Gorton, Jennifer Dunn, Rob McKenna, even Dino Rossi was a moderate. And the base never liked that. But we, the political professionals, the moderates, what the base used to call the Bellevue Mafia, we held on to control of the Republican Party. And that was true nationwide. I was a member of the Republican National Committee. And the party was controlled by relative moderates. People would always talk about, oh, right wingers, but who do we nominate for president? Reagan, then Bush, another Bush, and Dole, and McCain, and Romney. Moderates, not Pat Buchanan, not Pat Robertson. Well, that all changed with Trump. Donald Trump was the candidate that the base had always wanted, and they were just waiting for. And the base rose up and overwhelmed the establishment. And he won the nomination, and he won the election. And they savagely, it's politics, it's their right, they took absolute control of the Republican Party. County central committees, state parties, the RNC, as we recently saw, and the base, the Trump base, absolutely controls the Republican Party now. There is no Republican Civil War, okay? There are some former Republicans like me who've gone off into the wilderness like the French Maquis resistance and are trying to create something new. And you've got Liz Cheney out there bravely standing up, but she has no power in the party, and neither do I. There is no Republican Civil War. It's over, and my side lost. On the other hand, the Democrat establishment held on in 2016 and 2020. Bernie Sanders did not take over the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Socialists, who are a major departure from the Clinton, Biden, Obama moderates, did not take over the Democratic Party. They nominated the most moderate person running, Joe Biden. Here in Washington State, the party is still run by Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell and Jay Inslee, who are relative moderates compared to many of the new members of the legislature and people like Pramila Jayapal. So tonight, as of right now, the Democratic Party is still controlled by relative moderates, but there is a war going on in the Democratic Party. And every Democrat would agree to this. There is a huge conflict going on all across the country between the new left versus the establishment. The elections we just had in Seattle were a beautiful example of that. You had the the left-wing elements of the party, which control the actual party function, the party organizations, endorsing the most liberal person running for mayor of Seattle, while the former Democratic governors like Gary Locke and Christine Gregoire endorsed Bruce Harrell, who ended up winning. The Seattle attorney's race was even worse. The person the Democratic Party supported was this new creature we have in Washington, in American politics, called an abolitionist. That's somebody who runs for prosecutor but wants to abolish basically the criminal justice system and not arrest anybody and not prosecute anybody. Well, I'm exaggerating a bit, to the point where, again, the Democratic establishment, the former Democratic leaders, not the parties, endorsed a former Republican running for Seattle City Attorney. And you now have routinely very hotly contested elections between left-wing Democrats and moderate Democrats for everything. County council, city council, state legislature. Most of the Democratic incumbents in Congress have primary opponents way to their left. So there is a big conflict in the Democratic Party. And how that plays out is going to determine a lot of things. So politics used to be about money. I guess to sum all this up, for all our previous party systems, the differences by and large were economic. Southern planters versus Northern bankers, right? Business versus labor, farmers versus Wall Street. Economic conservatives who believed in cutting taxes to grow the economy versus Keynesian Democrats who wanted to use government spending to prime the pump. But the big fights, healthcare, were about economics. Today, that doesn't matter. Nobody debates healthcare anymore, or the gold standard, or the Federal Reserve, or cutting taxes. Today, the great debates are about culture, race, and religion. If you saw today, Senator Rick Scott laid out an 11-point plan for Republicans to run on in 2022. And he's the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the guy that runs the campaigns for the US Senate. And it was all about saying that kids have to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and be taught that America is the greatest country in the world, and critical race theory and abortion, and nothing about inflation or economics. It was all about culture and race and religion. You now have this white Christian nationalist tenor to the Republican Party that, yes, they care about abortion and they disagree with the Supreme Court on marriage, but they also view the whole idea of Black Lives Matter and defunding the police and athletes not standing for the national anthem as an insult to America. And America was founded as a Christian nation. So therefore, when you are showing disdain for America, you're showing disdain for God. On the other side, what animates the Democrats is these kind of cultural issues on the other side. The whole Black Lives Matter, various the Green New Deal in a lot of ways. So it's now all about race and culture and religion. And people wonder, I'm not sure very many people would disagree with that, but they wonder why. Why has this happened? And it is not because of Fox News or because of Zuckerberg and Facebook. It's not even because of Donald Trump. Politics is always ultimately driven by reality, by real events happening on the ground, okay? And the reality is this: America's changed. If you want to know why our politics has changed, look at the census data. This country is far more ethnically diverse than it's ever been. We are on a path to be where white people will be no longer a majority in the United States. And we used to be proud of that we're a melting pot, and we really weren't. Okay, there were a lot of immigrants, but guess what? They were white and Christian. You know, I may not like the Irish, but they're white and they're Catholic. That's not true anymore. And now you're seeing, you know, this major infusion of not only non-white immigrants, but people who are Muslim. You now have women elected to the U.S. House who are Muslim and wear a Muslim headscarf in the floor of the House, which is fine with me, but to some people, it's just jarring. Okay. And just as rapidly as the country has changed ethnically, it has changed culturally. When I was the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, if the Democrats just hinted at putting language in their platform to support same-sex marriage and legalize marijuana, we'd put out a press release saying it was loony, left-wing, crazy Democrats. Okay, Barack Obama didn't support same-sex marriage. Hillary Clinton did not support same-sex marriage. The first major Democrat that did was Joe Biden. Overnight, practically, America has shifted on these issues, way to the left. Now, most people would say, great. I mean, I think that's great. I have no problem with that. But you now have a ton of people in this country who are older and white and Christian, and they'll come up to you and say, this doesn't feel like my country anymore. They go to the store and they're the only white face they see. They have people speaking languages they don't understand. They drive down the street and there's signs in Korean and Spanish. And they turn on the TV and they see, you know, mixed race couples, even same-sex couples kissing on TV in commercials. Okay, I have no problem with that, but some people do. Okay, and this is very fundamental to who we are as a species. Nobody reacts very well when their culture is changing and they look around, their neighborhood looks different. And on the other hand, you have the other party driven by people who want to push these changes harder and faster and more of them. And it is absolutely understandable and inevitable that our politics would change like this. We have just been lucky that it hasn't happened here before. I mean, if you look around the rest of the world, politics has always been driven by race, culture, and religion. What is politics like? What is it about in Ireland? It's about Catholic versus Protestant. For centuries in Europe, it was Catholic versus Protestant, Muslim versus Christian, Arab versus Jew, Hutu versus Tutsi. In whenever it becomes tribal, whenever politics becomes tribal, it becomes incredibly dangerous. Okay, because if you're threatening my tribe, I don't really care what the rules say. I don't really care if I lose the election. I'm going to fight you. I have. When we were debating, you know, you want to raise taxes 5% and I want to only raise taxes 2%, we could compromise in the middle there, right? But there, when you're debating whether or not abortion is murder, there is no middle ground. And when you take the position that these changes to public policy threaten your faith, there is no middle ground. And there's an awful lot of Christian Americans now who believe that Christianity is under attack. It's not, but they believe it is. You know, the whole war on Christmas and stuff, that's deadly serious. And so our politics has become unbelievably tribal in a way that we haven't seen in this country ever. Even the Civil War, again, was about, yes, somewhat about culture, but it's about economics. The South did not believe they could possibly survive without the institution of slavery. This is very different. And it is incredibly dangerous. There are now serious people out there writing serious articles about the possibility of civil war in the United States. So where are we now? Well, as I said, there is no civil war going on in the Republican Party, but there is a resistance. This weekend, there's going to be a meeting in Washington, or two meetings in Washington, D.C. Oh, wait a minute. The CPAC is in Orlando, Florida. The Conservative Political Action Committee, which is a longstanding event that draws conservatives from all across the country is now completely taken over by the Trump wing. They're meeting in Orlando, Florida. And in Washington, D.C., there's a smaller meeting of something called the Summit on First Principles, basically launched by the tribe that I'm a member of, which is Never Trump former Republicans. And there'll be several hundred people there, including Liz Cheney, and discussing traditional, what we think are traditional Reaganite conservative principles. There are several organizations out there now. The one I'm involved in, I think, is the most important, which is the Renew America movement. There was a meeting in February of 2020 of about 150 of us former Republican elected officials, party chairs, members of Congress, governors, discussing what we do next. And there was a great split in the group. Some of us, including me, believed we should move immediately to form a third party. Others said, no, you can't do that because there can only be two parties in America. It just drives me insane. And so we split the difference and created a movement. The Renew America movement is a PAC and a organization with staff, and we exist to help win elections and to build a grassroots network of like-minded people dedicated to preserving democracy and some basic American principles. So we've agreed we would support candidates of either party if we believe they fit our criteria, or people running under a new banner. So this year, we are supporting in Washington State, Jamie Herrera Butler and Dan Newhouse, both of whom had the courage to stand up against Donald Trump and vote for impeachment. We're supporting a lot of Democrats around the country. And you're starting to see more people coming forward to run as independents. Former Republicans who are clearly identified as former Republicans who are leaving the party and running for office as an independent. Recently, a candidate announced in the Arizona's 5th congressional district. He was running against a Republican incumbent there. The former governor of Alaska, Bill Jacobs, or Bill Walker, is running again for governor of Alaska. And the best example is my friend Evan McMullin, who is a former Republican, former CIA officer, former high-ranking Republican staff person who ran for president as an alternative to Trump a few years ago. He's running for the United States Senate in Utah against Mike Lee. And what these races have in common, at least a couple of them, and I think there'll be more, is the Democrats are standing aside. They know they can't win in Utah, so they're not going to run a candidate at all. And Evan is working to build a coalition of Democrats, moderate Republicans, and independents to defeat a Trump Republican. I think you're see more of that in 2022 and going forward. As we head into 2024, there's a lot of speculation. And I think that the biggest factor is going to be who decides to run for president. If Donald Trump runs, and I believe he will, he'll be the nominee. But what does Joe Biden do? Will he run again? If he doesn't, who will the Democrats nominate? It's hard to imagine they're going to nominate anyone as moderate as Joe Biden. And if they nominate someone to the left, you will see a serious independent or third party candidate run, probably a former Republican, somebody like Liz Cheney. I'm not predicting she will, although that has been discussed. And you're starting to see real discussions about how, not for 2022 probably, but how, if we're going to create a new party, how do we do it? Andrew Yang left the Democratic Party and created something called the Forward Party. There's another group called the Serve America Movement, which is a party. You have our organization, which we call RAM, Renew America, which has elected officials, donors, and state chapters being formed. It's just like a party. It would not take very much for all of this to coalesce to create a new centrist, right-of-center political party in the United States. But I think it's going to be very dependent on what does Joe Biden choose to do, what does Donald Trump choose to do. Because I'll just tell you, in February of 2020, before COVID hit, there was a meeting in Washington, D.C. of a number of us active Never Trumpers, several former Republican governors and others, and everyone in the room agreed that if Bernie Sanders was the Democrats' nominee, we would launch an independent campaign. You know, maybe somebody in that room would have run for president. But if Joe Biden's the nominee, hey, we can all get behind that. Well, Biden became the nominee. If the Democratic Civil War begins to result in the Democratic Party moving way to the left, I think you will see finally the creation of a new party, mostly made up of former Republicans. But we'll see. All we know is right now, democracy is in great danger. If Trump had won in 2020, I'm not sure we'd be having this discussion right now. I can't imagine what a third Trump term would look like. And I think that is very realistic. I think, the most likely result is the Democrats take majority in at least the House, perhaps the Senate in 2022, which makes it easier for them to overturn elections. And they may not even have to overturn the election. I mean, Trump, if he runs again, he will win Florida, he will win Ohio, he will win Texas. If a Republican wins Florida, Ohio, and Texas, they only need a few more, just a couple, some combination of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona. I mean, he nearly won last time. And I shudder to think what would be left of the United States Constitution if he comes to power again. So we're living on a knife's edge right now. All we can do, I think, is go out and campaign, try and win elections, make sure the right people get elected. But it's a fight. With that, I will. Whoa, I've talked longer than I thought. I will stop and take any questions you have, so long as you have them. Dave, you're muted.
All right. Well, you've given us a lot to think about there. I've got a lot of thoughts I've written down. Would you say, the seventh party system is as dysfunctional as we've ever been? And how do we get out of it? I mean, if it's all about culture, how does a third party solve that? You know what I mean? We're all about effective government. How does a third party, I'm for it, but how does a third party solve the culture problem, the culture war?
So I would think maybe maybe like for the fourth party system, the one that led to the breakup that created the Republican Party, might have been even more dysfunctional. I mean, we ended up, if you look at the elections in the 1850s, you saw that third party candidates from the Free Soil Party, the Know Nothing Party, all started winning elections because people were looking for something. Both the Republicans and Whigs, both the Democrats and the Whigs were defenders of slavery, and people were just sick of it and looking for something new. That system blew up. I mean, just blew up and led to the Civil War and led to the rise of the Republican Party. This one is a close second, I would think. In my perfect world, what would happen is a new party emerges that splits the Republican coalition. I want the Republican Party to break up, to split. If you unite moderates and Trumpists, you come up with a Republican Party that can win elections, which we've seen. But if we could peel off the moderates and the Republicans who are not 100% MAGA, just take 20% of them and pull them out of that coalition so they won't vote Republican. And so the Republicans start losing elections over and over again. If you could, and this is what they fear. And this is why so many Republicans stick with Trump. They know that if they abandoned Trump and turned on Trump, they would tear their party to pieces. In 1965, Dan Evans spoke in front of the Republican State Committee in Port Angeles and got up and basically said, I want the right-wing wackos at that time, the John Birch Society, to leave. He basically, and a bunch of them got up and stomped out. He drove them out of the Republican Party. He could do that because the majority agreed with him, okay? But it did split the Republican Party. They know that if they, believe me, I've had these conversations, if they got up and turned on Trump and demanded that the Marjorie Taylor Greens and others would leave the party, they would tear it to pieces and they would lose elections, which I think would be great, because losing is what causes a party to change, and maybe they'll figure out they can't win with those people. The other alternative is a party emerges, that coalition of moderates from both parties that can compete, that can win 25% of the seats in the US House and deny either party a majority and force them to come together and negotiate. But I don't think you can solve this culture problem, because the realities on the ground are realities, okay? And you're not going to get people who are troubled because they see fewer white faces in their neighborhood. You can't talk them out of that. You cannot, bring them around. You just have to make sure they don't win the next election. And if we have only two parties, then it forces people to choose the lesser of two evils, and enough choose, I don't like Trump, but I'm going to vote Republican. That's the value that a new party would have, if that makes it, reshuffling the deck and preventing the extremists from winning.
We have a question from the audience. We have a long-standing history of systemic institutional racism in America. So why isn't today's resistance to race different?
Why isn't it different?
So why isn't today's resistance to race different?
Yes, there's been racism in this country from its founding, but you didn't see, and that every once in a while you'd elect an African American, but now you turn on the TV and the Democratic Party is dominated mostly by Black politicians in many ways, or non-white politicians. And that is jarring to people. That is jarring to people, to racists. And this whole idea of aggressively making the point that the questioner makes, which is we've had longstanding systemic racism. People have said that, but now it's really out there. And these Republicans, they would not agree with that statement. They do not believe there has been longstanding systemic racism in this country. And by you saying it, you are insulting America. And by insulting America, you're insulting God, and I won't have it. And so that's why it's very, very different than in the past. I mean, it's easy to stand up and support a minority when you know they have no chance of being the majority. It's a different thing when you elect our first Black president, and you have very prominent non-white politicians in this country. And to people who are worried about that, they go out the street and chant, "You will not replace us." So that's why it's very different than in the past.
So I have a question. So what is it going to take? I mean, what's it going to take to get a viable third party to start winning congressional or state legislature seats? I mean, I've looked into this a lot. I mean, I personally think ranked choice voting could help. But the primary electorate, right? It's the ideologues primarily, right? It's whatever turnout is, it's 30% or whatever. How does that change? What does a third party have to do to gain real traction to start being the difference makers in Congress and state houses?
So I get asked this sort of question all the time. I don't think I've answered it very well ever. I'm going to try and do better right now. I'm just, we could tonight snap our fingers and form a party. There are lots and lots of tiny little meaningless parties out there. There are. There's the new Whig Party. There's the Libertarians themselves, the Greens. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a new major party. And I don't think anyone can create that. I think it has to happen organically. But when enough people just decide, by God, it has to happen. In the 1850s, enough, and it has to come top down. I mean, every major party in American history has been formed not by citizen activists, but by existing politicians. In 1854 and 1856, a bunch of Whig senators and governors said, "This is nuts. I mean, the Whig Party's doomed. Let's meet and create something new." And it was a bunch of politicians in a back room, and they created the Republican Party. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt and Hiram Johnson, the governor of California, and many other very prominent former Republicans said, we can no longer support Taft and where he's taking the party. And they had an alternative convention and formed a new party. That's the only way it's going to happen. So here's how it could happen tonight. If tonight Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney and Ben Sasse and Jamie Herr Butler and half a dozen other dissident Republicans would get in front of a bank of cameras and say, we're done. We're done. We're leaving the Republican Party and we're forming a new entity tonight. It would happen overnight. But it's going to take that kind of explosion. Ranked choice voting helps. Other reforms help, like what we have here in Washington State with our top two primary and no party registration. It is very feasible that you could have an independent run for office and be very competitive in the right atmosphere. In other states, it's harder to get on the ballot. But it's got to be because you have an idea that is so powerful that it's undeniable, and existing politicians who can raise money and know how to actually compete in the political world to make it happen. And I'm telling you, I think that I know that there are elements out there floating around. There's like vapor in the air just waiting for a spark to ignite it. And I think, again, what could ignite it is a sense that the Democratic Party has gone off the deep end on the left, and the Republican Party has remained loyal to Trump. When it really becomes, if it had ever been just a choice between Sanders and Trump, this would have already happened. But you and I can't create a third party. It's going to have to happen organically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and just quick
So,
follow
I'm
up.
telling you, it very well might. There are lots of discussions going on out there in back rooms and closed meetings.
And do you think that, you mentioned Herrera Butler and Liz Cheney and some others. Do you think that what holds them back is fear of losing their careers?
Yes, part of it. Some of them, yes. Others, they hold on stubbornly to this idea that the party can be saved. We can still compete and win primaries. We, the establishment, the moderates. Others are held back because of what I said before, that they know that if they stood up and repudiate Trump and basically tell his supporters, leave the Republican Party, you'd blow the party to pieces and it would lose. And the other big thing is people, I can't count the number of my old friends who are just like, okay, yeah, I hate this guy, but it's gonna go away. He's gonna retire, or he's gonna die, or he's not gonna run again. This too shall pass. This era will change. And they are just wrong. They're wrong because even if Donald Trump left the stage tonight, all the other factors I talked about in terms of white evangelicals and nationalism and culture and race is not going to change. And when Trump leaves, the Republican base is going to demand a new Trump. They're not going to turn to Mitt Romney.
Thank you.
So what do you think Liz Cheney's long game is then?
I don't know, because nobody believes she has a chance to survive a closed party primary in Wyoming. The polling there is just terrible. She's gonna lose. Because again, the Republican base, really, honest to God, no fooling, loves Trump. I don't know what she's thinking. No, I'm not sure anybody. I don't know. People speculate that she's all about seeing this January 6th commission through to the end. Other people speculate she's going to at some point decide to run in Wyoming as an independent. Other people speculate she's going to run for president as an independent or something, or even challenge Donald Trump in the Republican primaries. I don't know Liz Cheney, and I don't know anybody who has any idea what she's doing, because she's not gonna survive. I mean, you may end up with the only of all the 10 House impeachers, what, 3 or 4 or 5 have already decided not to run again. Jamie Herr Butler might be the only one that survives because of Washington State's top 2 primary and the nature of the 3rd congressional district.
What do you think Newhouse's chances are?
The 4th congressional district is very conservative. It's the most conservative district in the state. Now Trump has endorsed Lauren Culp. Oh my. But now that there is a Trump endorsed candidate there, he'll raise a bunch of money. I mean, Dan might make it. He might make it through the top 2 because there's several other Republicans running, so he gets through the top 2. But then it'll be okay. So the reason Herr Butler can survive is this: if she gets through the top 2, the 3rd congressional district, which is Southwest Washington, is Republican enough that a Democrat can't win. But there are enough Democrats who would vote for Herr Butler against a Trump Republican. So if Jamie makes it through the top 2, she will probably survive. But Dan is, even if he gets to the top 2, he's going to face a Republican, a Trump Republican in the final. I don't see him winning that. But we'll see. We'll see.
What are your, this comes from one of our chat questions here. What are your thoughts on Alaska's new voting method, open primaries with ranked choice voting, which was mentioned earlier, and how that's impacting the race to unseat Senator Murkowski? Do you think she makes it?
Murkowski would not have a chance were it not for ranked choice voting. And because of ranked choice voting, she's probably, 55% likely to win. Because when you play it through the different steps of the ranked choice voting, she ultimately wins. Ranked choice voting is a great step to help moderates survive. But people who are waiting for ranked choice voting or any other reform to save us are foolish. I mean, first of all, no legislature, be it Republican or Democrat, is going to create a system with ranked choice voting, because the parties hate ranked choice voting because it takes away their power. So Republicans and Democrats are not going to support ranked choice voting. It has to be done by initiative. And most states don't have initiatives. And we certainly don't have it at the federal level. And you'd have to amend the Constitution, and that's not going to happen. So you're going to see ranked choice voting still nibbling around the edges, being passed here and there, but it's not going to save America.
Here's a question for how does voter suppression fit into your analysis?
Voter suppression is real, but it is not. It is not the main driving factor. Not even close. I mean, Republicans purposefully will try and make it harder for people to vote for all the reasons we understand. But the thing is, if people are motivated, they find a way around those obstacles. They will wait in line for 14 hours if they have to vote. And in fact, when you engage in voter suppression, you often just make people more angry and they're more determined to vote. So, I mean, voter suppression is obnoxious and evil, and shame on the US Senate that they can't pass voting rights legislation. But it is not, it's not what's going to kill us. And neither is gerrymandering, by the way. which is also obnoxious and evil. But the courts are turning back most of these terrible gerrymanders. And for every state that Republicans drew good lines for them, the Democrats drew really good lines for themselves in New York and California, and will pick up seats because of it. So, I mean, again, I think too many people want to nibble around the edges and debate things that are interesting and are impactful, but aren't the core. The core is race, culture, religion, and our two-party system, which locks people into this doom loop duopoly where they have to make a choice. That's the issue here.
On that, one of our watchers asked, I feel like I know your answer here, but what about income and wealth inequality being at the base of our underlying dysfunctional politics?
It's not true. That's not the case. I mean, there's always been rich, there's always been poor. The difference is rich people used to vote Republican, now they vote for Democrats. The richest zip codes in America vote Democrat. People, it's not people like, what? If you don't believe me, go look. There are rich Republicans. There are, of course, and the Koch brothers and all of that. But poor people now, if they are, unless they're non-white, they're voting for Republicans. I mean, the poorest parts of Washington State are the most Republican parts of Washington State. Economics has flipped, and economics doesn't matter anymore.
Here's another question from the audience. How effective do you expect the Yang and Kinzinger movements to be, and how do they differ?
Well, Adam Kinzinger is trying to create some sort of pact to help. I don't even know what he's trying to do. It changes all the time. I think I don't know. I don't know what Adam Kinzinger is trying to do. And Andrew Yang flat out said he's creating a new party. I don't think that just Andrew Yang on his own and his supporters is enough to form a new party. If you start to see a bunch of these groups come together under the leadership of some, former elected officials or current elected officials, that you could start to see an interesting party. I mean, Andrew Yang needs to merge with some other groups, and the whole thing needs to, like atoms, connecting into something bigger. But on their own, they can't affect anything.
You mentioned Evan McMullin in Utah. Utah seems to me to be a very interesting state. I followed third-party movements, and they have a movement. I forget the name of it. Perhaps kind of a third party there. Are you familiar with it?
There is a third party there, and I think they're supporting Evan.
Yeah. So but they put a lot of candidates out, and They appear to have some support. But they also adopted elements of ranked choice voting and done some other things. I mean, they seem to really be kind of a laboratory, and it's a red state.
The most important thing about Utah is also important about other places. This third party or independent, because I think you're seeing a bunch of people running this year as independents who are like-minded, but there's no party for them. So if we see some people get elected as independents, they're going to do, guess what? They're going to eventually become part of a party, a new one. This works in districts or states where one party or the other has stepped aside, given up. Democrats know they can't win Utah, so they're going to urge Democrats to vote for Evan McMullin. If he had a serious Democrat on the ballot, he would have no chance. In our state, I look at a place, and I keep mentioning Bellevue. I look at a place like Bellevue, like the East Side, which the Republicans don't even compete there anymore. But I don't believe those affluent suburban voters are really happy voting for, liberal Democrats either. I think a new party could emerge in these suburban communities that used to be Republican. But it has to be where one party has stepped aside, at least to get it off the ground. That's why Utah is interesting.
What role, another audience question, what role has the opioid crisis played in the party-based change to a Republican Party?
I don't think any. The opioid crisis is horrifying. If you haven't seen Dope Sick, which is a documentary with Michael Keaton and others about how Purdue Pharma basically created the OxyContin crisis, you should watch it. It's great. It's a horrible tragedy, but I don't see how it's changed our politics.
Okay.
Another question from the audience. What happens to the Republican Party if Trump is indicted for one of his seemingly illegal activities in New York or his alleged part in the insurrection on January 6th?
So in my mind, the base that loves him will never stop loving him. If he gets indicted, convicted, even sent to prison, they'll just view it as the liberal establishment, trumped up charges. He was framed. It's all a conspiracy. It's Hillary's fault. They'll never abandon him. I can't. He might even run from prison. I don't think there's no prohibition in the United States Congress. In Washington State, if you're a convicted felon, you can't run for office. That's Washington State law. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says that can't happen. But if Trump, for whatever reason, leaves the stage, the leader of the Republican Party is going to be determined by who is able to convince the base that they're the next Trump. Again, Ben Sasse, Liz Cheney, Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, who's a very, very moderate Republican. They are not going to win the primary. It's going to be Pence, probably not, because Trump turned on him. It's going to be the governor of Florida, DeSantis, or it's going to be one of the Trump children. The base will look for the next Trump. Their passion for, I've never seen anything like it in American politics. I still have neighbors with Trump flags in front of their houses. The passion for this guy is incredible, and it has not abated. I mean, you live in Spokane. What do you see? I mean, it's, and even if he leaves the stage, his movement is not going to end.
Another question from the audience. I've belonged to No Labels forever, but they and the other centrists seem strangely ineffective. I believe that it will take a major crisis like slavery was to make it happen. But even Trump isn't, I can't read it, hasn't been big enough, hasn't been a big enough crisis. Sorry.
So in politics, I was very, very, very active and still believe in this in a group called Fix the Debt, which was the political arm of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is a group to basically agitate for a real solution to fix our debt crisis. And we did press releases and we did op-eds and we flew to Washington, and it didn't move anyone. It didn't make a difference. No Labels and the First Principles PAC, all these groups that have been formed to try and get more bipartisanship and stuff in Congress have had absolutely zero impact, because what drives politics is political parties. If you're not a party, you're nothing, really. What needs to happen is, again, all these moderates and people who are looking for a third way, No Labels, whatever, they need to coalesce and create a party and run candidates and fight on the political battlefield. Otherwise, they're just talking. What matters is winning elections, period.
What are your expectations for the 2022 midterms?
If right now the numbers, I've been doing politics a very long time. I have never seen numbers this bad for the Democrats. They are terrifying. Biden's approval rating is well below 40. The generic ballot has Republicans ahead anywhere between 3 and 4% or 9 or 10%. And understand about generic ballot, that's when you ask people, are you going to vote for a Republican or a Democrat? There are more Democrats in America than Republicans, but the Democrats all live in big cities. So like in Spokane, the Democrats win the 3rd legislative district by a huge margin, right? But the Republicans win the 5th and the 4th and the 6th and the 7th by lesser margins, but they win. And so the generic ballot usually shows Democrats ahead because there are more Democrats than Republicans, but they all live in cities. So to win a majority, Democrats need to be ahead by 5, 6, 7 points in the generic ballot. If when I was a Republican, if we went into the election day within a couple points in the generic ballot, we felt really good. I mean, think about Seattle. I mean, huge voting bloc. Seattle is huge in a statewide election, but in terms of getting majorities in the legislature, the fact they get 80% in their districts doesn't really help them. They're wasted votes. So again, if I was a Republican back in the day and we went into election day within a couple of points, we felt really good. Well, they're ahead. They're ahead by a lot in the generic ballot. If the election were today, it would be a Democratic debacle. You could even see the Republicans winning the majority in one house of the state legislature, which I did not believe was possible anymore. Hopefully, as we come out of COVID and the masks come off and the country opens up and the weather gets warmer, the economy gets a little better. Hopefully Biden's numbers, the Democratic numbers will get better. But if the election were today, it'd be Republican tidal wave.
So you think which wing of the legislature in Washington, the Senate or the House?
The House. They're in the House, only half the seats are up at any one time, and there aren't very many competitive seats up. But in the House, when they're all up at the same time, I mean, it would be close. It would be a long shot, but I mean, it is not inconceivable that Republicans could take the majority in the state House.
Okay.
So I have a question. Kabir, you brought up Larry Hogan, and I followed him a little bit. He's in a blue state, but is enormously popular, correct?
Yeah.
Very popular. And in Washington, we have nothing like that, right? We have no competition at the statewide. I mean, who's the last Republican? I guess Kim Wyman won a statewide race, but maybe the only one.
The last time, but we elected Dwayne Berenson, what's his name? The treasurer who just lost the election from the Tri-Cities. Anyway, yes.
I don't recall his name, but
so this has been a source of great frustration throughout my career. I mean, we've been able to elect Republican governors in places like Vermont and Massachusetts and Maryland. And like, how? Well, a governor's race is interesting because it's about state issues, and it's about the individual. It's not as nationalized. And in a lot of these East Coast states, you had Democratic state parties and machine politics that were somewhat corrupt and incompetent. And Republicans run and say, we're going to clean up the state capitol and stuff. We're going to fix, and they're able to win. Even when people are voting for Democrats or everything else, they'll vote for Chris Christie in New Jersey. They'll vote for a Republican gubernatorial candidate. We have had excellent, until recently, the Washington State Republican Party has usually nominated very good candidates for governor. Dino Rossi, Bill Bryant was a good candidate. Ken Eikenberry, the Attorney General, on and on. None of them won. Someone came very close. I mean, remember Dino Rossi, right? I was the chairman of the state party when that all happened. I think the difference is Republicans were never able to make the case that Washington State is a mess. because it's not. It's not. I mean, there are things I think are wrong, but haven't had the corruption or scandal or our pension system isn't broke, you know? And I don't think Republicans have been able to make the win. You got to say to people, I know you don't like to vote for Republicans, but in this case, you need to. And Republicans have never been able to make that case because I don't think Olympia is strong enough to get people to do that. That's but Larry Hogan, he has this delusion, I think, again, that the party will go back to what it was. And there's no way that's going to happen.
He may get primaried.
No, he's term limited. He can't run for governor again. So he's thinking of running for president as a Republican. Good luck.
Here's a question from the audience. What moderate Democrats in Washington state do now to support a moderate policy at the federal level?
Say that again.
What can moderate Democrats in Washington state do now to support moderate policies at federal level?
Well, they are. If you look at the Washington state congressional delegation, all the Democrats from this state are moderates from the Democratic Party. I mean, Patty Murray, Maria Cantwell, Derek Kilmer, I just forgot her name, First District, Susan DelBene. In the US House, there are two big caucuses of Democrats. You have the progressive Democrats, and you have the new Democrats, which are the moderates. Right now, the chair of the progressive caucus is Pramila Jayapal from Seattle. And the chair of the new Democrats, the moderates, is Susan DelBene from Washington state. Before that, the chairman was Derek Kilmer from Tacoma. I mean, we Republicans used to like to talk about how incredibly left the Democrats are in the state. Well, they aren't. They weren't. They're Democrats, but they were not nearly as far left as, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, except Pramila Jayapal. She is very, very liberal. One example, of course, is trade. Washington state is the most trade-dependent state in the nation. And Reagan-type Republicans were adamantly pro-free trade until Trump came along. And Democrats voted for trade deals. Patty would courageously stand up every time and vote for trade deals, even though the labor unions would scream at her for it. So I think that Democrats in Washington state are pushing for moderate policies. They're not the other than Pramila Jayapal, they're not part of the new left.
Okay.
Imagine, because it's going to happen someday. Someday, there's been no movement in the Democratic Party. Someday, Inslee's going to retire, Patty Murray's going to retire, Cantwell's going to retire. Imagine those primaries. The D party comes apart in this state.
What do you think? What do you think if people were nearing the end here, but people that want to see a third party, maybe they align with you politically, maybe you don't, maybe they just think there'd be good competition. What can they do? People that are wanting effective government, we're about effective government. What do you think they should be doing right now?
Doing what we're trying to do with the Renew America movement, which is make sure the right people get reelected. Desperately trying, hoping the tide turns and Republicans can control the US House and the US Senate. So right now, the most important thing is make sure Jimmy Herr Butler and Dan Newhouse survive. So write them checks, go ring doorbells, help them. Those are the two key races in 2022. And again, it is really about election. And for 2022, it's stand and fight wherever you are in your state for the races that matter. And we have two of them in this state that matter. So that's what it comes down to. I saw a question either in chat or Q&A about abortion. I think the question was something along the lines of what would a new party do about the fact that there are so many people who are pro-life?
Yep, I see it on the chat side, yes.
Yeah. I obviously you wouldn't exclude people who are pro-life from your party, but a new party to form is if it's going to have to be a party that is the great unicorn of American politics that we've talked about for so long. Fiscally conservative, pro-free enterprise, pro-economic growth, strong national defense, support for NATO, but socially tolerant, even liberal, pro-choice, pro-same-sex marriage, not yelling about transgender rights and critical race theory, whatever that even is. So a party that has the elements from both parties. So hardcore cultural conservatives should stay with the Republican Party. I mean, I would love it if the hardcore evangelical Christians and the Trumpists would stay in their party and let the socialists stay in their party. Give me a party of moderates.
Dave?
Okay. One more question here from the audience. What do you think is the underlying cause to the ardent passion of Trump supporters?
Race, culture, and religion. Race, culture, and religion. These are white people who see that the world is changing and they don't like it. They see either that, you know, these athletes aren't respectful to American traditions, or the whole Black Lives Matter people, or people rioting in the streets, defund the police. They don't like the change that's happening. That's what it's all about. It's about race, culture, and religion. I keep saying it and saying it and saying it, and nothing else. But you know, people, it's not polite to talk about race and religion, right? We don't want to talk about those things. And we also think there's got to be some way to avoid this. Let's just regulate Fox News, right? Let's just do a better job keeping disinformation off of Facebook. Well, that'd be great, but that's not going to change it. That's not going to change it. America is changing. America is becoming more diverse. And the same thing's happening all over the world. That's why you have Viktor Orban in Hungary and the government in Poland and the French presidential election, which is going on right now, where you have a far-right candidate in the top 3. And the fact that neo-Nazis have seats in the German Bundeswehr for the first time ever. The people who are about blood and soil, about national identity, they're rising up all over the place. And we just have to, we're not going to change it. We just have to make sure they don't win. We have to make sure those people don't win. That's a good way.
So if Trump comes back and wins re-election, or not re-election, I guess wins the next election, and his supporters have strong support in the House and the Senate, let's say big majorities, do you feel, what's your level of concern regarding the judiciary being a brake on preventing abuse of power?
You know, one thing, that's a great question. One thing we learned during the Trump years is the courts do not act quickly enough to stop a rogue president. Trump, I don't think he did it on purpose. I don't think he's smart enough, but he figured out the great weakness in our system, which is really, if you have a president who is willing to just flaunt the Constitution, you can't stop them. Because the courts act too slowly. You can appeal and appeal and appeal. And as long as he's got 1/3 of the votes in the US Senate, he can't be convicted. Donald Trump blatantly spent money that Congress did not appropriate. That is a violation of the Appropriations Clause of the US Congress. Congress sued him, and I mean, he did this on the border wall when he stole money and spent it on the wall when Congress told him not to. and he did it anyway. And that is a blatant impeachable offense. And Congress sued him, and the time ran out in the lawsuit. The judge, some court finally dismissed it because it was moot, because Trump was no longer in office anymore. He blatantly violated the emoluments clause by profiting off being president with his hotels and other things. Congress sued him, and it changed nothing. He blatantly conditioned foreign aid to Ukraine on them performing a political favor for him. He got caught, and Congress impeached him, and he couldn't be convicted. He fomented an armed insurrection against this country, and Congress wouldn't impeach him. This is why it is so terrifying. If you have a person elected to the office of President of the United States, and they are willing to do whatever they feel like doing, there really is nothing that can stop them. Think about that for a moment. It's true. Unless they go so far that their own party will turn them. Imagine what that would be.
And in light of that, I guess a follow-up would be, what do you think about, nuking the filibuster and stuff like that, and how that would...
If I had my way, we would have a constitutional convention and rewrite the whole thing. Get rid of the Electoral College, get rid of the ridiculous United States Senate, where you have Wyoming has the same amount of power as California. It's absurd. There's no good reason for it. Make it clear in the Constitution that you can't have unlimited debate in the U.S. Senate. Our system is deeply, deeply compromised. And when the Constitution was written, it was the best document in the world. Now it is just a mess. But here's the thing: it's not gonna happen. It might as well be, let's debate whether or not it's gonna be 75 degrees tomorrow so I can play golf. It's not going to happen. The only way that you can make these changes is if both parties will agree, and the Republicans won't. The Republican Party knows very well that the only reason they're relevant is because of the ridiculous elements of our Constitution, the Electoral College and the representation in the U.S. Senate. They can govern this country as a minority if they win the right number of states and the right number of senators. They know that, and they know it's the only thing that keeps them in the game, and they will never allow it to happen. Perfect example. For 100 years or so, the Republican Party platform said Puerto Rico should be a state. Not anymore, because they know if Puerto Rico was a state, you'd have 2 Democratic senators in Puerto Rico, and so they're never going to support that. And so there is no magic bullet. Ranked choice voting is not going to save us. We're not going to get rid of the filibuster. Just forget about it. The only thing that matters is winning elections. Make sure the right people get elected.
All right, with that, we're going to end. And thank you very much, Chris Vance, for speaking tonight. It's been a very interesting conversation, to say the least.
Yeah, but no fun, right?
Well, I don't know if I'll sleep to it, but that's beside the point. Mm-hmm. So I just want to close by putting in a plug for PEG. PEG is a small grassroots. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. PEG is a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. If you find these events helpful, please join us as a member or make a donation to PEG. We line on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. Please visit our website now.org. And on behalf of the PEG board membership, we wish to extend our sincere gratitude again to Mr. Vance. Thank you also to the audience. You're the reason we do this work. A video of this forum will be posted on our website in a couple of weeks. The next forum is in 4 weeks from tonight, and our speaker will be retired Rear Ambassador Ryan Crocker on March 22nd. Thank you again, and good night.